So I think there's a lot of pressure for everybody to do it. And I think some people are ready to do it and some people aren't. And so the way that I would distinguish, like, are you ready to walk into like my most difficult family member conversations? Like when I do that for myself, it's like, how am I feeling today? Is it in a place where like if someone asked me something that I would find deeply offensive, like can I sit there with the discomfort and sort of push through it without them knowing that I'm really uncomfortable? And that's sort of what I'm looking for. And the reason that I do that and try to sit in my logic brain is that I find that like when I'm ready to have a conversation about race, the other person feels blindsided. And when people are blindsided, they act crazy sometimes. Like they just say stuff that they don't mean because they're kind of nervous, or they're like, I have to deflect and get out of this as soon as possible. It's like a very fight or flight response. So I'm like, if I'm de-escalating the conversation the entire time and I'm committing to de-escalating it in every sentence that I'm saying, I just need them to stay as long as possible, right? So like each sentence that I can get in that they've heard me say, even if they're kind of pushing me away, means that they've at least heard it. And so I try to think about my goal for the conversation is I'm de-escalating it. And on top of that, I'm like adding small pieces of new information to each sentence that hopefully some of them stick in their mind and they think about it when they leave. You wouldn't leave another soldier in your army behind. You would support them when you're on a team. Why do you say all lives matter? Like, if someone had their leg shot off, would you be like, okay, well, all lives matter, bye, I'm leaving you? And he was like horrified, right? So I had to kind of tap into the specific things that were, again, like really concrete for him and sort of find the commonality in this value, because he really cared about values. So I was like, here's the commonality in this value between a social movement and the army. So especially with my Mexican family, there will be like a joke, like a pretty openly anti-Black joke going on about crime. And the next day I'll be like, hey, I really want to talk to you about this thing that you said. And I try to start with questions so they don't feel cornered. So I'd be like, do you think that's true? Like, how do you understand the difference between this community that you've identified as other and like our family? Are we similar? Like, we live in the same neighborhood. Like, why are they different? Concepts for their like structural racism, like all these other things, right? The more I can kind of ground it in examples that mean something to them, the less they are both kind of freaking out and trying to run away from the conversation. And also the more that they're like, oh, is this idea that I've kind of built into a bogeyman or something that I allow myself to have really strong feelings about that cloud my ability to kind of engage with it? That joke was not funny. Let me help you understand why it's not funny. And actually, like a funny thing I've noticed that works surprisingly well, and I have a lot of feelings about how well it works. But when especially kind of middle-aged men make jokes that are sexist or racist, I find that one way to de-escalate it really quickly is to be like, yeah, I've heard that one a bunch of times. It's boring. Surprisingly works really well. They're like, oh, I'm not funny. And then they're like, what? Why? Like, I don't understand. Like, it's worked so many times. And I'm like, it's old. Like, we don't do that anymore. Humor has moved on. And it's actually kind of surprising how well that de-escalates it without them being like, oh, it's just that you're a snowflake millennial, which is where I need them to not be, you know, where I'm like, there's a lot of stuff I want to say to you right now, but I'm going to start with this so that I can tell you why. And then maybe you'll edit yourself next time. Racist is an adjective. We're all racist. We've all internalized things. So it's a changing process. It's not that you are static. It's an adjective for something. And I think articulating it that way helps it not feel like you have to defend yourself to the death. Because I think that's sort of what is harder, is like when I've tried to tell family members that something is racist, they freeze and are like, oh my God, this is like being told that I'm irredeemable and like I have to get out of this, or like prove that this is not the case and I'm not on trial. With my Mexican family is very Christian. It's easy for me to point to Jesus and be like, the reason that he is not human is that he's always setting an example of like what it means to be good, and you're always trying to improve, but we don't expect you to be Jesus. I sort of blindsided them. I'm gonna let them have feelings. Like, I'm prepared for this conversation and they're clearly not. So I'm just going to let them have their 5 minutes of feelings, and I'm going to put on my earmuffs and like look like I'm listening so they feel okay, but I'm not going to process any of the things that they're saying until they calm down, right? So it's like an internal boundary that I set for myself. One of the things they try to do is like they try to derail the conversation by being like, what about?
Yes.
And you're like, oh yeah, 40 topics that most people spend like an entire academic career writing about one of those things. I just want to talk to you about this one really concrete thing today. Like, if you want to keep talking, I would love to keep talking. We could talk about that next time, right? Like creating this can be open, what we would call toxic positivity, right? Where they're like, everything's great. Why are you complaining? America is so great. We're so free and happy and joy. And like everything can get better. I'm like, okay, so how about this idea that like if you love something, you can give it feedback and it can improve? And then they're like, oh, yeah, that's not complaining. So I'm like, okay, that's where I am. So it's like if I'm only talking to someone who's not like me, it's a very creative process. So I try to point that out to the devil's advocates where I'm like, so again, with me kind of taking the air out of the really stupid racist jokes that sometimes happen, I'll be like, well, I've read that a few hundred times as op-eds in every newspaper in the last 50 years. Do you have a more interesting argument that I have not read already? And then I smile at them. And usually by then they're like, no. A lot of people ask me, why do we have to name things? Like, why can't we just focus on the small issue, whether it's the bad joke? It's like, why does it have to be called racist? Because they feel like that's escalating it. And the way that sociologists explain this is like, racism is kind of an abstract concept. You need to describe it for people to understand what it is and improve. So we name things so that we have other cases we can look at to see what worked and what didn't, so we can address this. It's like you're building a dictionary that gives you language and tools to try to deal with it. And usually when I'm like, this is why we name things and kind of organize information, people are like, oh, okay. It is an adjective. It's not like a permanent fixed state of suddenly, like I'm about to be struck by lightning and it's over, right? So you don't have to agree with me, but I'm hoping that I can tell you like a few things I'm worrying about right now as my parent who has conversations with me about emotional well-being. Can we talk about these things that I'm really nervous about? Like if my neighbors and like if my child is like, I'm worried about our neighbors, I'm worried about like people not being able to go to school, I'm worried about mothers with their kids, I'm worried about mothers like watching their kids get hurt because the cops are showing up, like all of these horrible scenes. They're like, it's not that these people need to be quiet, it's that they're just trying to live, like, and that makes me feel unsafe because it's still my neighborhood and still my community.